Welcome back to the Neurospicy Mom Pod, your cozy corner of the internet. There is something that I want to address at the beginning of this episode, and that is that I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea how to create a podcast the correct way to maximize exposure or success. I have no idea how to create social media that pulls in audiences. I'm new to it myself and I'm still learning. I have no idea how to create an online community because I've never had one before and I've never really been a part of one before. And I don't know what the appropriate or acceptable response is during this moment in time in our history. But I do know what my body feels. And I know that I feel completely activated and dysregulated in such a deep psychological way that I can recognize I don't have a social script for this. I've felt horrified since October 7th. And then came this deep sense of betrayal when the veil lifted and I realized how the United States has always been the blueprint for this kind of evil that we're seeing in the world, and the regret of not being able to see it sooner. And maybe that's because I'm finally out of a relationship that demanded that I look the other way, that belittled and mocked my extreme sense of justice as a waste of time, as a defect of my own personality. Now that I'm single and in my own physical space, I'm free to absorb and express my feelings openly. And I almost don't know how. I feel overwhelmed and I feel like screaming at the top of my lungs. And then I feel horrified watching everyone pretend that everything is fine and business as usual. I struggle to even function. My creativity has been affected, and maybe I don't know what to do with all of these big feelings. But what I can assume is that I must not be the only one feeling this way. And although I do believe that our justice sensitivity and our unwavering morality is what makes neurodivergent people the foundation of humanity, I also think that there's something else that makes us extraordinary. And that is our ability to feel and to find joy. I was feeling depressed and hopeless this weekend after watching what's happening in Minneapolis. I felt so bad in my body. And then I stepped outside. And while everything was still happening, my body was able to also fully feel the beauty of nature. It was so cold that it smelled like snow, my favorite smell. My body felt chilled and alive, refreshed by the air. And my ears could hear all of the little birds chirping above me, reminding me that still life perseveres. And it reminded me that there is life outside of these events, that terrible, awful things have always been part of the human condition, and still nature persists. So today I want to turn our attention to the good, just for a moment, not to invalidate the pain, not to bypass the grief, but to make room for the full spectrum of what our nervous systems are capable of holding. Because neurodivergent joy is not denial. It's regulation. So let's talk about a piece of neurodivergence that almost never gets talked about. And when it is talked about, it's usually flattened into something inspirational and meaningless. Autistic and neurodivergent people don't just experience distress more intensely, we experience everything more intensely. That includes grief, rage, fear, and injustice, but it also includes joy, beauty, fascination, awe, and meaning. And the reason this gets lost is because most research, media, and cultural narratives about neurodivergence have been built almost entirely around pathology, around what's broken, around what needs fixing, around how close we can get someone to act normal. But when researchers actually ask autistic adults about their lived experiences, not parents speaking for them, not clinicians interpreting them, not systems measuring compliance, something else very different emerges. Joy for many neurodivergent people is not about achievement or status or external validation. It's not about positive thinking. It's not about pretending things don't hurt. It's about immersion. It's about the feeling of your nervous system settling into something that feels coherent, predictable, meaningful, honest, alive. A lot of autistic adults describe joy as something that happens when their attention is allowed to fully rest inside something without interruption or performance. deep interest, sensory experiences that feel regulating rather than overwhelming, time in nature, creativity without an audience, moments of truth where you don't have to mask or soften or explain yourself. That's not accidental, that's neurological. Autistic nervous systems are wired for depth, for intensity, and for pattern recognition, for sustained attention, which means joy doesn't come from surface level stimulation. It comes from alignment, from the moment where your internal rhythm matches what's happening around you. That's why autistic joy often looks quiet from the outside, but feels enormous on the inside. It's not loud happiness, it's not manic positivity, and it's not dopamine chasing. It's that moment where your whole body says, "This makes sense. I can breathe here." To understand why joy matters so much for neurodivergent people, we have to talk about the nervous system itself, not in the buzzword way, but in a real lived experience way. When human beings are exposed to ongoing threat, and I want to be clear here, the threat doesn't have to be an immediate physical danger, that nervous system adapts. It reorganizes itself around survival. That threat can be personal, like abuse or neglect. It can be social, like marginalization or chronic invalidation. It could be systemic, like political violence, authoritarianism, or witnessing large scale harm that you are powerless to stop. And for justice sensitive people, especially neurodivergent ones, that threat is processed continuously because our pattern recognition doesn't allow us to compartmentalize. We don't just see isolated events. We see systems. We see trajectories. We see the history repeating itself in real time. So the nervous system stays activated. Fight shows up as rage, activism, argument, or constant urgency. Flight shows up as doom scrolling, anxiety, hypervigilance, or the urge to escape. Freeze shows up as shutdown, numbness, depression, or an inability to function. And fawn, especially familiar to autistic women in light diagnosed people, this shows up as over explaining, minimizing yourself, or trying to be reasonable in the face of harm. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough. A nervous system that never gets to experience safety doesn't become more ethical. It becomes exhausted. And exhaustion doesn't create change. It creates collapse. This is where joy comes in, not as escapism, not as denial, or not as looking at the bright side nonsense, but as a biological necessity. Moments of joy activate different neural pathways than threat does. They engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the part that's responsible for rest, digestion, repair, and integration. They allow stress hormones to come down. They restore cognitive flexibility. They give your system the capacity to stay awake without breaking. Joy is not a luxury. It's how nervous systems recover enough to keep caring. And there's something deeply inconvenient about autistic joy because it doesn't align with productivity culture or capitalism or authoritarian systems that rely on urgency, fear, compliance, and constant output. Neurodivergent joy often comes from things that those systems don't value: slowing down, repetition, sensory pleasure, wonder, deep focus, honesty, authenticity, nature, truth without polish. And that makes it quietly radical. When you choose to let your body feel the cold air instead of staying glued to the screen, you are reclaiming your nervous system from fear-based control. When you let yourself become absorbed in something you love without monetizing it, explaining it, or justifying it, you are refusing to reduce your existence to usefulness. When you notice beauty while the world is burning, you are not betraying the cause. You are refusing to let your humanity be flattened. Neurodivergent joy says, you don't get to take my depth and my aliveness. Now let's ground this in science, not because lived experience isn't enough, but because some of us have been gaslit for so long that we need to see the data to trust ourselves again. There is a growing body of research showing that autistic and neurodivergent nervous systems are not simply more anxious or less resilient, but are actually more sensitive to both threat and reward. In other words, the same nervous system that feels injustice more acutely is also wired to experience meaning, beauty, and joy more intensely when the conditions allow it. From a neurological standpoint, autistic brains show differences in how information is integrated across sensory, emotional, and cognitive networks. This means that experiences are often processed more globally, more deeply, and with less filtering. So when something feels bad, it can feel overwhelming. But when something feels good, it will feel safe, coherent, or meaningful. It can be profoundly regulating. Researchers studying autistic adults have found that well being improves not when people are taught to suppress their traits, but when they're allowed to engage with their strengths, their interests, and their preferred sensory environments. Quality of life increases when autistic people are supported in doing what brings them intrinsic satisfaction, not extrinsic approval. This is important because for decades, the dominant assumption was that autistic joy was either rare, childish, or irrelevant. But when researchers actually asked autistic adults how they experience joy, a very clear pattern emerged. Joy is most often described as embodied, immersive, and deeply tied to authenticity. It shows up in moments of focus, creativity, connection to nature, ethical alignment, and truth telling, not in surface level happiness. There's also research from positive psychology that's especially relevant here. Studies on strength based well being show that when people regularly engage their core strengths, things like honesty, love of learning, curiosity, appreciation of beauty and fairness, they report higher life satisfaction and lower levels of depression and anxiety. Autistic adults, interestingly, tend to score higher than average on most of these strengths. The problem isn't a lack of capacity for well being. The problem is that our environments rarely reward or protect the ways we naturally access it. And then there's the nervous system piece, the part we can't ignore if we're talking about justice sensitivity. Chronic exposure to threat, whether that threat is personal trauma, systemic violence, or constant awareness of global harm, that keeps the nervous system locked in survival mode. Cortisol then stays elevated and the amygdala stays on alert. Cognitive flexibility decreases, our creativity narrows, and over time, this leads to burnout, shutdown, depression, and a sense of hopelessness that isn't ideological, it's physiological. What's crucial here is that joy interrupts this cycle. Moments of joy, especially sensory and meaning based joy, activate that parasympathetic nervous system. They lower the stress hormones, they improve vagal tone, they allow the brain to shift out of constant threat detection and back into integration. This doesn't make someone less aware of injustice. It actually makes them more capable of sustained awareness without collapsing. In other words, joy doesn't make you complacent, it makes you resourced. There's also emerging research in ADHD and broader neurodivergence that shows something similar. People who are encouraged to play to their strengths, those strengths like creativity, spontaneity, humor, hyperfocus, they report better overall well being than those who are constantly trying to correct themselves into something they're not, aka masking. Again, the theme is the same. Flourishing comes from alignment, not compliance. So when we talk about autistic or neurodivergent joy, we're not talking about denial. We're talking about nervous system regulation, cognitive sustainability, psychological survival. Joy is not the opposite of grief. It's what allows grief to move without destroying the body that it carries. There is something that I want to be very clear about, and that is that you do not have to choose between caring deeply about injustice and allowing yourself moments of joy. You don't have to earn joy by suffering enough first. You do not have to wait until the world is safe. Neurodivergent people have always lived in the tension of contradiction. We hold grief and wonder in the same body, rage and beauty in the same breath, fear and creativity in the same nervous system. That's not weakness, that's capacity and honesty. And honestly, it's what has allowed humanity to survive every dark chapter it's ever lived through. So I'm not going to give you homework here, even as a former teacher. I'm not giving you a challenge. This is just an invitation. At some point this week, notice one moment where your body softens instead of braces. One sensory experience that feels grounding rather than overwhelming. One thing that makes you feel present, not productive, not useful, not impressive. And when you find it, let it count. Don't minimize it. Don't compare it. Don't tell yourself it's not enough. Just like that moment of me going outside and taking a breath of fresh air. Those moments matter because joy doesn't erase the truth. It helps us survive in it long enough to change it. Before I close, I want to say this very plainly, without softening it and without pretending I don't need support and without packaging it into something cute. Making this podcast takes time, energy, emotional labor, research, and a nervous system that is often already stretched thin. Right now, the only place I am able to directly monetize this work is through Patreon. There are no ads, there's no network, there's no backer quietly footing the bill behind the scenes. So if this episode resonated with you, if you felt seen, regulated, grounded, or even just less alone, subscribing on Patreon is the most meaningful way you can support this work continuing. That's where I can speak the most freely, where deeper conversations live, and where your support actually translate into sustainability for me. And if Patreon isn't accessible for you right now, subscribing and following me on YouTube also genuinely matters. It helps this work reach people who need it. It helps signal that conversations like this deserve space. I don't take your time or your attention lightly, and I am so grateful you're here, truly. If you'd like to stay for our journal prompt, it is coming up next. If this is where your time ends with us, then I want to remind you that you are loved, you are special, and that you are important. Take care of yourself and take care of your nervous system. And I'll see you next week, lovies. Okay, let's move into our journal prompt for this week. I want to remind you and give you explicit permission to do whatever feels best for yourself here in this moment. You can write it down, think about it later, meditate on it, or just let it sit in your body, whatever your body and brain needs. All right, let's get into this week's prompt. What does joy feel like in my body when I'm not trying to earn it, explain it, or justify it? I'm going to say that one more time. What does joy feel like in my body when I'm not trying to earn it, explain it, or justify it? If that feels too big, you can start smaller. Like, where does my body soften? Or what feels regulating instead of impressive? Or something like, what kind of joy feels honest to me, not palatable to others? Remember, there's no right answer. It's just information for yourself. Thank you again for being here, and I love you so much. I'll see you next week. Ta-ta.